The entire auction room went quiet the moment the old wooden clock was carried through the door. Not because it was beautiful, it wasn't. The casing was split along the back panel, the face was clouded with oxidation, and one of the brass feet had snapped off somewhere along the way, leaving it tilted at an awkward angle, like a man favoring a bad knee. A few of the junior appraisers near the back actually exchanged looks, the kind people trade when they're trying not to laugh. But Margot Ellison-Crane walked it in herself. Didn't hand it to the staff, didn't let anyone else touch it. She carried it the way you carry something irreplaceable, both hands, slow steps, eyes forward, and the room noticed that more than the clock. Margot was 41 years old, and ran one of the most respected auction houses in Halifax. She had a reputation for being impossible to impress, and even harder to fool. Dealers flew in from Montreal and Toronto, hoping to charm her, and left quietly, with politely declined handshakes. She had turned down estate collections, worth hundreds of thousands, because something didn't sit right with her. Her instincts, people said, were either a gift or a curse, depending on which side of the table you were sitting on. The clock had belonged to her grandfather, Eric Ellison, a Norwegian clockmaker, who immigrated to Cape Breton in the early 1960s with almost nothing except his tools, and the particular stubbornness that seemed to travel well across the Atlantic. He built the clock by hand over 3 years. Every gear, every spring, every face panel, made in a backroom workshop that smelled of cedar oil and pipe smoke. When he died, the clock stopped. Not metaphorically, literally. It simply stopped ticking the morning they found him, as though it had decided there was no longer any reason to keep going. Margot had kept it on a shelf in her office for 11 years. Couldn't bear to display it properly. Couldn't bring herself to sell it. And couldn't find a single person in the city, or anywhere else she'd quietly asked, who was willing to say honestly that they could restore it without gutting it first. 3 workshops had told her the same thing in different words. The movement was too corroded. The hand-cut gears didn't correspond to any standard sizing that could be sourced. The internal striking mechanism, which her grandfather had designed himself, was essentially a one-of-a-kind system that nobody working today had ever encountered before. The last appraiser she'd spoken to, a man from a well-known Toronto firm, had looked at it for exactly 4 minutes, before sliding it back across the table and telling her, not unkindly but very clearly, that she should think about having it preserved as a display piece, rather than a functioning one. Seal it in a case. Let it be beautiful and still. Margot had driven home that evening in silence and sat in her car in the garage for a long time before going inside. She wasn't ready to let it be still, so when a colleague mentioned, almost as an aside at the end of a dinner conversation, that there was a clockmaker working out of a small shop in Dartmouth. Not a fancy one, a real working shop on a side street that mostly did repair jobs for old families and marine instruments. Margot didn't say anything. She just filed the name away, Desmond Farrell. She wrote it on the back of a receipt that evening, and left it on her kitchen counter for 2 weeks before she finally called. Desmond Farrell was 44 years old, and had been repairing things since he was 9. That wasn't a figure of speech. When he was in grade 4, his teacher's overhead projector jammed during a film strip about Canadian provinces. And while she went to find the custodian, Desmond quietly opened the back panel, identified the bent arm that was catching the sprocket, straightened it with a pencil eraser, and had it running again before she returned. She'd stared at him for a moment, and then asked how on earth he knew to do that. He shrugged and said he didn't know, he just looked at it until it made sense. That quality, the patience to look at something until it made sense, turned out to be the one thing in his life that never left. His shop on Windmill Road was small, and perpetually cluttered in a way that had its own internal logic. Clocks in every state of disassembly lined the shelves. Marine chronometers, carriage clocks. A 1920s Vienna regulator someone had found in their grandmother's attic. An entire wall of small drawers, each labeled in Desmond's handwriting, containing springs and pivots and click wheels sorted by size, in a system he could navigate by feel in the dark. The shop smelled like machine oil, and the particular dry warmth of old wood. He lived above it, had for 7 years. His daughter Willa was 12 now. She had her mother's eyes, dark brown, very direct, and her father's habit of going quiet when she was thinking hard about something. She did her homework at the workbench most evenings, headphones on, occasionally handing Desmond a tool, without being asked, when she could tell from his posture that his hands were too occupied to reach for it himself. They had a rhythm together, the kind that develops slowly and without discussion between two people who've had to figure out how to be a family of two. Desmond's wife, Carolyn, had died 3.5 years ago, ovarian cancer. The kind that moves fast and doesn't announce itself until it's already made itself at home. They had 4 months between the diagnosis and the end, and Desmond had spent most of those 4 months trying to make sure Willa wasn't frightened, trying to make sure Carolyn was comfortable, and trying very hard not to think about what came after. He hadn't entirely succeeded at the last one. After she died, he kept the shop open because he didn't know what else to do. Work was the one place where the grief had edges, where he could look at a broken thing and understand precisely what was wrong and what was needed. The rest of life didn't offer that kind of clarity. But a seized escapement wheel did. A cracked mainspring did, and so Desmond worked, and Willa grew, and the small shop on Windmill Road stayed open 6 days a week. He was not famous, he was not written up in magazines, he didn't have a website, and the sign above his door was hand-painted and slightly faded. Most of his clients were people who'd been coming to him for years, or people those people had sent. Word of mouth, trust passed along like a handed-down tool. That was how Margot found him. When she called, he listened without interrupting. When she described the clock, the hand-cut gears, the custom striking mechanism, the Norwegian maker's marks she'd never seen replicated anywhere, there was a pause on the line. "Can you bring it in?" he said. "Not I'll take a look, not I can't promise anything, just, can you bring it in?" She said she could. Margot arrived on a Tuesday morning with the clock wrapped in moving blankets and set in the back seat of her car like a passenger. She carried it in herself. Desmond held the door. He set it on his main bench under the good lamp and spent the first 10 minutes simply looking at it, not touching it. Looking. Margot stood to the side and watched him, and didn't say anything, which was unusual for her. She was not, by nature, a patient woman, but something about the quality of his attention made her feel like interrupting would be wrong. He asked her, eventually, to tell him about her grandfather. Not about the clock. About the man, she told him, about the workshop in Cape Breton, the cedar oil smell, the way Eric would hold a movement up to the light for minutes at a time, rotating it slowly, before ever picking up a tool. How he used to say that a clock was just time made visible, and that the worst thing you could do to it was rush. Desmond nodded slowly at that, still looking at the movement under his lamp. He used a modified lever escapement, he said. But he altered the pallet geometry. "I've only seen something like this once before, in a textbook about pre-war Swiss workshop practice. He must have learned it before he came over." He paused. He was trying to make it run quieter. The standard lever gives you that tick-tock beat, but what he wanted was smoother, less intrusive. He glanced up at her. Did he sleep near it? Margot blinked. What? The clock? Was it in a bedroom? His bedroom? She thought for a moment. Yes, on the dresser. Desmond nodded like that confirmed something. He built a clock that wouldn't keep him awake. That's what this is. Margot looked at the clock for a long moment. She hadn't known that. Nobody had told her that. She'd spent 11 years looking at this object and not knowing the most human thing about it. She told him to do whatever it took. He told her it would take time. She said that was fine. She'd been waiting 11 years already. What followed was 4 months of work, that most people in Desmond's professional circle would have said, wasn't economically rational. He had to fabricate several of the replacement parts himself. The gear sizing Eric had used didn't correspond to any standard inventory, so Desmond sourced blanks and cut them to specification on a small lathe he kept in the back room, a process that required 3 failed attempts before he had gears that meshed to his satisfaction. The pallet fork, the component that had seized and stopped the clock, was corroded beyond salvage, so he made a new one, using measurements taken from the original and cross-referenced against the Swiss technique he'd studied. There was an evening in the 2nd month when he sat with the movement fully disassembled across a velvet mat and thought seriously about whether he'd taken on something beyond him. Not because he couldn't understand the mechanism. He understood it well enough by then, could trace Eric's logic through every decision the old man had made. But because the margin for error was extremely thin, because if he forced the wrong fit, he could cause damage that would genuinely end the clock's life as a functional object. He sat with that weight for a long time. Willa appeared in the doorway with 2 mugs of tea. She set one beside him without a word, sat on her stool, put her headphones on and opened her homework. Desmond picked up his loop and got back to work. The nights had a rhythm, Willa doing homework. Desmond bent over the bench, the radio playing low. He found himself talking to the clock sometimes, which he recognized as mildly eccentric but didn't particularly mind. He'd talk through what he was doing, why he was making each choice, the same way he used to explain things to Carolyn, who'd sit in the armchair near the bench on weekend evenings, and ask questions that were always more perceptive than he expected. The habit had stayed. The audience had changed. Margot visited 3 times during the restoration. She never came unannounced. She always called first, always asked if it was a good time, and when she arrived, she was different from the person Desmond had imagined from her reputation. Quieter, more careful. She asked about the work in detail, not impatiently but genuinely, and she remembered what he'd said from one visit to the next. On her second visit, she brought coffee and a box of Willa's preferred brand of cookies, which she'd remembered from an offhand mention. Desmond hadn't realized she'd filed away. On her third visit, she stayed late enough that Willa fell asleep on the old couch. In the corner, her homework half finished, an oil rag tucked over her like a blanket, because the shop got cold after dark. Margot had been sitting on a stool, watching Desmond work, and when she noticed Willa, she went still for a moment. Something crossed her face that she didn't try to cover. "How does she do it?" Margot asked quietly. "Do what?" "Sleep anywhere so completely." Desmond looked at his daughter. "She trusts that things are fine," he said. "She's got good instincts about that." Margot looked at the clock on the bench. "Your wife, the one you lost, was she like her?" He didn't answer immediately. "In some ways," he said eventually. "Willa's got more of her mother's stubbornness, and the same way of watching people until she's made her mind up." Margot was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "My grandfather used to say the hardest part of any repair isn't the skill, it's the willingness to stay with something past the point where anyone else would give up." Desmond set down his tool and looked at her. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," he said. "He was," she said. And for the first time since she'd walked into the shop 4 months ago, her voice caught slightly. Just slightly. She recovered quickly. She always did. The clock was finished on a Thursday in early March, during one of those gray Halifax days when the harbor sits under low cloud, and the cold is the kind that's been there so long it stops registering as unusual. Desmond had been in the shop since before 6. Willa was still upstairs, still asleep. He'd done the final regulation the evening before, adjusting the beat rate, checking the strike count, listening to the movement run through a full cycle twice, and it had been right. But this morning he wanted to hear it one more time. In the quiet before anyone else arrived, he wound it carefully. Set the hands. Released the escapement. The sound it made was not what he expected. He'd restored a lot of clocks. He knew what a well-regulated movement sounded like. But this one was different. Eric's modified escapement produced a sound that was almost breath-like. A soft, even cadence, with none of the aggressive tick-tock percussion that most people associated with old clocks. It was the sound of something unhurried, something that had decided it had enough time, and didn't need to announce itself constantly to prove it. Desmond stood in the empty shop listening to it for a while. Then he went upstairs and woke Willa and told her the clock was running. She came down in her socks, still half asleep, and stood beside him and listened. After a moment she said, "It sounds like breathing." And Desmond thought that was exactly right. He called Margot. She came that same afternoon. She didn't rush, but she came quickly. When she walked in and heard it, she stopped in the doorway. She didn't move for a long time. The clock sat on the bench in a shaft of gray winter light, and it ticked in that quiet continuous way, and the room around it was very still. Margot crossed the room and stood in front of it and put her hand flat against the wooden case. Not on the glass, on the wood, the way you might put your hand on someone's shoulder. Desmond said nothing. Willa, who had come downstairs again and stationed herself on her stool, said nothing, either. After a while Margot said, "He'd have loved this." Her voice was steady. "He'd have wanted to know exactly what you did differently, and why, and then he'd have argued with you about half of it, and then he'd have admitted you were right." Desmond smiled. "I'd have liked that. He was difficult, she said, with obvious affection. Wonderfully difficult. She turned to look at him then. You didn't just restore it, Desmond. Something about it. It's better. The regulation, the way the strike lands. It's more like what he was reaching for than what he actually achieved. She paused. How? He told her. About the Swiss technique. About the 3 failed gears. About the palette fork he'd made from scratch. About a small adjustment to the pendulum length that he'd arrived at by calculation, and then confirmed by ear, listening to the beat the way you listen to music to find whether something is slightly off, tempo. She listened to all of it. Then she said, I want to show this. He looked at her. There's a horological exhibition in Ottawa in May, she said. Private, collectors, restorers, a few academics. It's the kind of room where people know what they're looking at. She met his eyes. I want to show the clock, and I want you there when I do. Not as a technician who did the work, as the person who understood what it was. Desmond started to say something about the shop, about whether he could get away. Bring Willa, Margot said. Ottawa in May is worth seeing. He looked at his daughter, who was making absolutely no pretense of not listening. Willa looked back at him with an expression that he recognized from her mother. The one that meant, say yes. He said yes. The exhibition was held in a converted heritage building near the Rideau Canal, the kind of room with high ceilings and long windows and good acoustics. It was small by trade show standards, maybe 80 people. But they were the 80 people in the country who would understand exactly what they were looking at. Collectors who'd spent decades acquiring significant timepieces. Academics who'd published on horology and watchmaking history. A few restorers, real ones, the kind who took on difficult work because the difficulty was once. Margot had positioned Eric's clock in the center of the display. She'd had it mounted at eye level on a clean wooden base, with no surrounding clutter. Just the clock, and a small card that said, in Margot's handwriting, made by hand, Cape Breton, 1963 to 1966. Restored Dartmouth 2024. There was no mention of Desmond's name on the card. He noticed that and then noticed it didn't bother him. The card said what it needed to say. For the first hour, Desmond stood to the side, while people moved through the room. He answered questions when people asked him. He explained the modified escapement to a retired professor from the University of Waterloo, who leaned in so close to the clock face that his breath fogged the glass, and who then straightened up and said with some feeling that he'd never seen that particular palette geometry in a Canadian-made piece of that era. Where did this man learn it? The professor asked. Norway, Desmond said, before he left. The professor looked at him. You fabricated the palette fork yourself. Had to. The original was past saving. From blanks? Yes. The professor looked back at the clock for a moment. How long? About 4 months total. The fork alone was a few weeks. The professor made a sound that wasn't quite a word but communicated respect. Later Margot found Desmond standing near the window with Willa, who had spent part of the evening reading a plaque about the building's history, and part of it watching the clock with the particular focused attention. That meant she was trying to understand something. She hadn't decided yet how to ask about. There's someone I want you to meet, Margot said. The someone was a woman named Bridget Saulnier, who ran a foundation dedicated to preserving Canadian craft heritage, furniture, instruments, and horology among other things. She was somewhere in her late 60s, silver-haired, and had the manner of someone who had been paying attention her whole life, and found most things still surprising. Bridget had been watching Desmond for part of the evening. She told him so directly, without apology, the way people do when they've decided the thing worth doing is to be straight. There's a project we've been trying to staff for 2 years, she said. A private collection in New Brunswick, old Canadian-made clocks and watches, early 20th century and before, some of it in significant disrepair. The donor wants it restored properly, not cleaned up. Properly. She paused. Margot told me what you did with the Ellison piece. I'd like to talk about whether you'd consider consulting. Desmond looked at her. What kind of timeline? As long as it takes, she said. That's the only answer the donor will accept. He thought about the shop, about the work he had waiting, about Willa and the commute and the logistics. All of it real and worth thinking about. Then he thought about a corroded palette fork at 1 in the morning. About 3 failed gears in a drawer. About a clock that sounded like breathing. I'd like to talk, he said. The moment Margot remembered longest, from that evening, wasn't the professor's reaction, or Bridget's offer, or even the room full of people moving carefully around her grandfather's clock. It was earlier, before the exhibition opened. When the room was still being set up, and the caterers were arranging things near the back, and the light was low. She had been standing alone near the clock, and she'd heard it ticking in the empty room, that quiet, unhurried sound, and she had thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that her grandfather would have been pleased. Not about the restoration, not about the room or the audience or any of that. He would have been pleased that someone had looked at the clock long enough to understand what he was actually trying to do, that someone had given it the time. She thought about what Desmond had said on that late evening in the shop, about Willa sleeping on the couch. She trusts that things are fine. Margot had not trusted that things were fine for a long time. She had not allowed herself to. She wasn't sure, standing in that room, that she was ready to now. But something about the sound of that clock, the one her grandfather had built, to be quiet enough to sleep beside, made her think it might not be as far away as she'd believed. Desmond drove home from Ottawa through the night, while Willa slept in the back seat, reclined under her jacket, her face turned toward the window, and the dark landscape moving past. He drove and thought about Carolyn. He did that sometimes still, not with the suffocating grief of the first year, but with something quieter. A presence, an acknowledgement. She had believed in him with a consistency that he had never fully understood while she was alive, and had come to understand much better since. She would have been interested in the Ellison clock. She would have asked the right questions. She would have looked at Willa, sleeping in the back seat of a car on the way home from Ottawa, and felt exactly what Desmond felt looking at her now. Which was a kind of tired, grateful amazement. He stopped for gas just past Rivière-du-Loup, and stood for a moment outside in the cold night air, looking up at a sky that was very clear and very full of stars. The highway was nearly empty. The world was very quiet. Sometimes the people society called broken were the ones with the longest patience, the ones who had learned, through loss, how to stay with something past the point where anyone else would give up. Desmond got back in the car. Willa stirred and didn't wake. He drove home. The shop would be there in the morning, the work would be there, and on the shelf above the bench, the space where the Ellison clock had sat for 4 months, empty now, returned to its rightful place, would remind him, every time he passed it, that some things are worth the time. That some things, given the right hands and enough patience, don't just get fixed. They come back more completely themselves than they were before. He pulled into Dartmouth just before dawn, the harbor flat and grey under the early light. Willa woke up as they turned onto Windmill Road, looked out at the familiar street and said, sleepily, we're home, Desmond said. He parked the car, and they went inside, up the stairs, and into the quiet apartment above the shop. And the morning came in slow and certain. The way mornings do when you've stopped being afraid of them.